The collapse of a superpower is rarely peaceful, especially one that is nuclear armed like the Soviets were. For decades, the struggle between the West and the East has become ingrained in the minds of everyone. The world is divided, it is what it is. While by the 80s, tensions had mostly died down from the existential threat of war and world destruction, there were still plenty of legitimate ways to try and win the Cold War by subversive means, diplomacy, and of course, simple, dirty violence. But nobody had expected that this would actually lead to the collapse of the Soviets, until it happened. Things began with Gorbachev's rise to power in the Kremlin, as he was, truly, a radical figure for Soviet standard. The Soviet system was failing. The once proud Soviet industry had dragged to a halt. A failing war in Afghanistan was delivering body bags to Russian mothers. Gorbachev saw that something had to change. He began reforming the economy while for the first time allowing the population to criticize the regime. And, importantly, he would greatly remove Soviet pressure on their Eastern European sphere. Gorbachev sought to focus inward, and trying to keep a bunch of nations that didn't want to be dominated by Moscow under their control wasn't really important now. So, in 1989, the true signs of collapse started to show. Hungary and Poland would see democracies come to power, while the opening of the Austro-Hungarian border provided a way for hundreds of thousands of East Germans to flee to the West, while the Berlin Wall too was torn down. The East German regime became unholdable. It was clear the Eastern Bloc was collapsing. Two issues would turn this so far peaceful process into a devastating collapse. The first was opposition to German unification. While it was clear that the East German regime was unsavable and the German people wanted unification, Germany's Western partners absolutely refused to allow it, threatening all sorts of sanctions. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, a coup occurred in Moscow, placing Gorbachev under house arrest as martial law was declared all over Russia. Suspected dissidents and nationalists were arrested, while the nominal autonomy of the republics was suspended in favor of harsh, direct rule from Moscow. This seemed to, initially, stem the bleeding, as Lithuania, the first state to truly declare independence, was forcefully reintegrated, sending a strong message to the other nationalities of the Soviet Empire. It seemed like the Cold War was set to continue into the next decade. But then, the Soviets made one crucial mistake. The Soviet Union was not enough for them, they wanted Eastern Europe back. So in mid-1992, a simultaneous invasion of Poland and Romania was launched. Yet, surprisingly, the Soviets failed to overrun the nations militarily, as a huge sense of nationalism drove the resistance movement. President Bush would make his famous quip that Poland is the next Afghanistan, as the West began a huge operation to supply the warring nations. Despite this, the Soviets would reach as far west as Warsaw before Czechoslovakia would join the conflict, realizing that if Poland lost, they would be next anyway. More shockingly, Finland would also join the conflict and began putting pressure on the Soviet North. Russia's nuclear threats, it seemed, were no longer taken seriously. America's position on the conflict was very clear. They would not directly prevent the Russian invasions, but they would also not stop supplying the nations under attack, and an atomic bomb on anyone would be considered an attack on the US. This was a war that the Soviets would need to win conventionally. In late 1933, the tides seemed to turn for the Soviets. Within Hungary, a group of ultranationalists came to power, ready to strike their neighbors to restore past borders. Despite ideological differences, Hungary would announce an alliance with Moscow, in what has been dubbed the Second Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But Hungary's intervention wouldn't lead to a swift Soviet victory as hoped, as America swiftly reached out to Budapest. They convinced Hungary to immediately betray their Soviet partners, in exchange for southern Slovakia and massive gains against Romania. The cost was steep, but Hungarian intervention was prevented, and to Romania and Czechoslovakia, the destruction of Hungary was promised the moment that Moscow surrendered. During all of this, Western European cooperation was collapsing. There were major differences in support for Eastern Europe, but more importantly, Germany had unilaterally declared unification. Immediately, German membership of the European Community was suspended. Border checks were thrown up and sanctions were announced. As you might imagine, this would cause an immense economic crisis in Europe, and thus cause a major split, as Germany convinced their smaller neighbors to ignore the sanctions, furthering the divides on the continent. Berlin itself was becoming more paranoid, as the economic downturn saw a rise in ultra-nationalist rhetoric. Meanwhile, the Soviets were putting pressure on the nation, which, on account of Western sanctions, became economically dependent on the Russian. Arguably, Russian oil was the only thing keeping Germany functional. Thus, Moscow would issue an ultimatum: join our invasion or lose your oil. Of course, Germany rejected this proposal, trying to call the Soviets bluff. Surely, this was something that the Soviet economy couldn't handle either. But it wasn't a bluff, and soon the German economy declined yet further, with several new nations now daring to join the sanctions too. Desperately, Germany did join the Soviet invasion, in a move that practically destroyed European unity. But Germany's invasion was far less significant than they had hoped. Germany's army was not made for fancy blitzkrieg maneuvers. It was created as a mostly defensive, relatively small supporting force within the NATO structure. Germany's invasion barely made a dent into Poland, aside from a semi-successful push into Pomerania. The Soviets had hoped to use this as a distraction and send their Ukrainian divisions into southern Poland. To their surprise, the army mutinied and captured their Russian commanders. Within Poland, they had started the Soviet Civil War. This would quickly start spiraling. The Baltics were the first to join the revolution, with Lithuanian partisans soon disrupting the Soviet invasion of Poland, leading to massive Polish counteroffensives. The revolting Ukrainian army would move east, soon leaving Poland and marching on Kiev, as several major uprisings would rock the nation. The Soviet collapse had been dragged out, but it would now come fast. Ukrainian successes would allow Romania to liberate themselves too, and even push further into Moldova. Poland too would fully liberate itself before marching into western Ukraine and Belarus. These disasters were just too much to take, and the Soviet government collapsed. As a new Russian Republic was announced, radical Soviet elements gathered in Kaliningrad, shielded from Moscow by the Baltic states, claiming to be the continuation of the Soviet Union. The new regime in Moscow was quick to sign peace with the independent states that they were fighting, even ceding Ukrainian and Belarusian territories in vain hopes that this could convince Ukraine to remain with Russia. Regarding Finland, a large amount of border territory was temporarily occupied until a responsible government took over in Moscow. Minor independence movements also rose up in Belarus, but these were swiftly crushed by Moscow, as most Belarusians feared a conquest by Poland more than Russia. Germany and Poland would also agree to a ceasefire, but Germany refused to leave occupied territories until it was let back into Europe as an equal member. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. Consider doing so to keep up to date with the latest videos. More importantly, in the description there is a link to the next poll. Now this one is slightly different, as I will ask you to seriously consider the question of what if Britain didn't enter World War I in 1914. If you want to contribute to that video, make sure to fill in the poll and subscribe to not miss its release. For now though, we leave Europe, but the issues aren't over. Russia's dominance over the remaining Union was extreme, and the new regime would call itself the Federated Russian Republics, dropping the idea of being a multi-ethnic, cooperative state. This would cause the Northern Caucasus to fall into guerrilla conflict, with the Muslims of the region uniting in their fight. This would sufficiently weaken Russia's control over the southern Caucasus, with those states breaking away as well. Of course, this process wasn't particularly peaceful either, as Armenia would swiftly invade Azerbaijan over Artsakh, and Georgia would even conquer the port city of Sochi. Over in Central Asia, the five republics too broke away, and Russia decided that it wasn't really worth another invasion, as they swiftly began fighting themselves. Kazakhstan particularly swiftly secured western Uzbekistan as well as Tajikistan, both in attempts to weaken their southern neighbors. This was important as Kazakhstan then started a war with Russia itself, committed to help the northern Caucasus states become independent, hopefully ending Russia as a threat in the region. Kazakhstani gains, combined with the Ukrainian successes in the west, would cause a Russian collapse in the region. The death nail would come from the east. China would force Mongolia to join an invasion of Russia, hoping to destroy Russian power in Siberia. Following these invasions, Russia recognized the inevitable and reached out to America, desperate to have them resolve the conflict. The price for peace was steep. The independence of the Northern Caucasus was confirmed, with Circassia and Astrakhan serving as temporary buffer states, set to eventually be reintegrated into Russia once clear assurances were in place to prevent a further Russian reconquest. Kazakhstan would be expanded so that they could serve to defend the region, though questions have been raised at the long-time viability of this plan. Ukraine's independence was also recognized, with a bit of border territory remaining under Ukraine's occupation. That leaves China, whose invasions were denounced, but this would soon stop being a problem. The collapse of the Soviets, still a big economic partner of China, had been a heavy hit. Beyond that, the communist ideology was swiftly losing popularity, and their recent invasions caused a huge host of sanctions from the US. The war in Russia proved unpopular, while India launched an invasion of contested territories in the Himalayas. Across the nation, pro-democracy uprisings would start taking place. While this was occurring, the North Korean regime faced a famine unlike any before, as they too were a state very reliant on the Soviets. Swiftly, South Korea intervened to announce a reunification of Korea, and even began to push into China to prevent China from invading them first. This would prove to overestimate the CCP, which would collapse following the fall of their capital to protesters. A new regime would be announced, with plans to democratize the nation. To facilitate this process, the Taiwanese constitution was temporarily announced across mainland China, with plans to write a new one soon. But not everyone agreed with this course. The Chinese army in Mongolia seized control and announced the continuation of the communist regime, as much of the north was invaded, though they'd mostly get bogged down in Inner Mongolia. During this chaos, the Uyghurs would secure their independence, as minorities in Yunnan broke away in the mountains, and Tibet was liberated by Indian forces. In Manchuria, Korea would continue their efforts, trying to create a buffer state, but international condemnation would force them to pull back. Though occupations of some parts are maintained to this day. Soon, the Taiwanese government would officially announce the unification of China, reaffirming their intentions to restore China's pre-collapse border, if not more, worrying many that conflict in Asia is far from over. The final conflict to cover were the Yugoslav War. While not as impactful as the world-changing wars elsewhere, they were still brutal. As Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, all hell broke loose. Initially, Serbia seemed to succeed in pushing back the independence movements, but their downfall would come from external forces, as Bulgaria and Albania invaded the south, causing Serbia's lines in the north to crumble. In response, Italy also got involved, occupying Istria while assisting the Croats in their counteroffensive. To the east, Hungary too would strike the south, and it seemed like Serbia was doomed. The Bosnian Declaration of Independence would secure Croatia's freedom, as a Bulgarian push destroyed the southern Serbian army. As the Serbians attempted a final reconquest of Bosnia, America would finally intervene, forcing a stalemate across the front lines, leaving Yugoslavia greatly reduced. So, this is the state of the world after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, a conflict-ridden Balkans set for more conflict as few are happy about these new borders. A Germany isolated with Western Europe divided. A Poland having territorial conflicts with all of their neighbors. A Russia humiliated, seeking reconquests, with nations like Kazakhstan expected to hold them back. And of course, China, the most populous nation in the world, in an active civil war, with intentions to restore their former glory. From here though, I hand the scenario back to you. Let me know in the comments what you think might happen next. And don't forget to subscribe and go to the link in the description to vote on what if Britain didn't join World War I. For now, thank you all for watching, and if you're interested, click on one of the videos on screen now to continue watching this series.